Today we're going to have our first lecture entitled, Is Correctional Treatment Effective? So what is correctional treatment or programming? As you can see from these images, it encompasses a lot of things that take place generally within a correctional institution, although it can also take place um, in the community as well once an individual is released from prison. It can include things such as educational programs, but it can also target psychoeducational issues related to people's offending, like what got them in trouble in the first place. And that's the primary focus of what this course is going to be about, these psychological treatments that we can administer to those who are involved with the criminal justice system. So correctional programming is generally referred to as rehabilitative strategies that focus on changing individual offenders. So psychology is the study of individuals and their mental health. Therefore, as opposed to sociology where you look at larger group differences, psychology looks at changing the individual. And so while some of our programs, or the majority of programs, especially in correctional institutions, are done in group settings, we are working to change each individual. The goal of correctional programming, which is somewhat different than individual psychotherapy for those who are not involved in the criminal justice system, is to reduce recidivism and increase a pro-social lifestyle. So while we do focus on mental health of individuals, the primary goal is to get them to stop recidivating. Our correctional programming is based on psychological theories of human behavior, primarily cognitive behavioral models, which we'll be talking about later in the course. And we focus on the analysis of illegal behavior. So as I mentioned, somebody may be depressed and while they're in prison, but if there were other issues that were related to them engaging in the criminal behavior that got them into prison, the depression will not be the focus of the intervention. It will be related to their substance abuse, they will be related to their sex offending behavior or their violent behavior. One of the things that's key to correctional programming, and something that you're going to hear a lot about in this course, is research, because without research, kind of this correctional programming is really not worth that much. We need to figure out what works and why that works. So we're really looking to identify and understand individual differences that explain criminal behavior. So that's why we study those who are involved with the criminal justice system. And a lot of you are watching those real crime shows because you guys have similar questions like, what makes somebody do that? What makes somebody murder or sex offend or engage in substance use or trafficking? And so what we do as researchers is really investigate those factors with the goal of identifying those factors so that we can develop interventions that work to stop people from offending. So, initially and we hope that our criminal justice system is designed to kind of, while it is a punishment, but the goal is really to teach people how to stop offending when they are released. And so we also want to look at these programs that we've created to figure out what precisely we can do to make people stop offending. So we give them these larger scale programs, but what about those programs is working? So which component of it? Is it the part where we focus on the anger, or is it the part where we focus on the way they're thinking, or is it the part that we focus on their substance use, or is it all those things combined? And so that's what research is going to help us do. And as part of this course, you guys are going to design your own program and also develop an evaluative strategy. So how are you going to research whether something works? So a lot of what we hear about and that you're going to be reading about in this course is whether this correctional treatment works. You've probably heard the term, what works? Nothing works. Why do you think that in the 2000s, we are still even debating whether or not we should treat offenders? Because we still are. There's still a lot of people who kind of feel that it's a useless endeavor. So just to give you a little bit of background, and you may have learned about this in some of your previous courses, but about 40 years ago, kind of in the 1970s or so, people became disillusioned with the effectiveness of offender treatment programs. And there became doubt in the public's mind about the government's ability to control crime. So that was kind of the time where Times Square, for those of you, probably many of you were not alive at that point, but it was infested with a lot of, strip clubs and things like that. There was a lot of crime in New York City. People were reading about a lot of violent crime going on. And so people felt like crime was out of control and the government really wasn't doing much to help. And so there was really this movement to get tough on individuals. And so we saw the increased use of sanctions. They kind of felt like back in the 60s, there was that hippie mentality. Prison was really not a punishment anymore. People were getting college degrees in prison. And so they wanted more punishment so that there was more aversive to stop crime. This was fueled by Robert Martinson's 1974 report, where he kind of reviewed treatment outcome studies, and his conclusion was that nothing works in offender rehabilitation. Interestingly, for those of you who may or may not know, Robert Martinson was a CUNY adjunct professor at the time. So he was working on a research team where they looked at 231 correctional programs that were conducted between 1945 and 1967, and they looked at the outcomes of that data. And so based on what Martinson read, he felt that this demonstrated that these programs were not effective. And he concluded that he and his team, with few and isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have no appreciable effect on recidivism. So Martinson became very famous for this quote, and this, as I said, was at that kind of that zeitgeist in time where people were getting tough on crime. And so here's a 60 Minutes report back from 1977. It's kind of funny to see kind of the old school, but here you'll see an interview with Robert Martinson.
Only for killing a police officer or a prison guard. In his final report on crime and punishment, Bill Plant tonight takes a look at the kind of offender law enforcement officials most want to reach, the juvenile.
Two squad cars responded to the early morning radio call. Burglary in progress. The intruder was familiar to them, a 13-year-old boy from the neighborhood.
Come on out of there. Come on. Now, we fooled with you long enough. Now, come on down.
We'll put the dog up here and let the dog sit down in the wall.
The boy's name is Charles, and he is no stranger. He's been caught in more than a half-dozen burglaries. Yet, because he's a juvenile, his record is confidential, to be destroyed and presumably forgotten when he reaches 18, no matter how much longer it gets. In some places, no records are kept at all.
Your ass belongs to me, boy. I'm gonna fix you. And you can't say too much now, because I get you now. I bet you that. You big enough to break in, and you big enough to take some consequences.
Because Charles is under 18, what he has done isn't called burglary. Instead, it's classified as an act of juvenile delinquency.
No, what? You talking about earlier this evening.
Because juveniles are routinely supposed to be given another chance, they get off a lot more easily than someone a few years older, whether the crime is burglary or murder. This is supposed to give youngsters a chance to straighten out. But the juvenile crime problem keeps growing, and some observers believe the system is entirely too lenient. Charles, for instance, has never spent any time in jail, just a couple of nights in a detention center. But if he had been convicted as an adult with everything he's been charged with, the same offenses would have cost him years, possibly life, behind bars. Crime is a problem of the young. Fully 50% of all crimes are committed by people under 18, and they're often crimes of violence. In Chicago last year, juveniles committed a third of the murders. In San Francisco, more than half of all felony crimes. More than 1.5 million juveniles were arrested in 1975. In California, there are 11 youth detention centers, 3 of them maximum security institutions, to which the courts send young people who have committed crimes as serious as murder, rape, and armed robbery. The treatment at these institutions includes solitary confinement. They have usually come from problem homes and been arrested many times before they are sent away.
I needed somebody to stay with me, and if I was doing something wrong, to come behind me and pick me up. I have my mom, and she can't do it herself.
What about your father?
Oh, he ain't there, but if he was there and kicked me around a little bit, I don't think I would have done it.
How many times have you been arrested?
26. I learned now that it ain't a game because they don't want to play with you no more.
Across the nation, more than 75,000 juveniles are in custody in 2,500 public and private institutions. And authorities say that if they had more room, they'd have the young people to fill it. A number of states now are considering legislation which would stiffen the penalties for juvenile offenders. Police complain that lighter penalties for juveniles are one reason adult criminals often use juveniles as decoys, particularly in drug dealing.
It doesn't take massive draconian punishment at the early stages of the process, but we've become so soft and wishy-washy at the early stages of the process that we tend to encourage crime.
I'll be about 75 years old when I get out of here. Is that what you're looking forward to?
This is an experiment in what might be called shock therapy at Rahway Prison in New Jersey. Young people who have had problems with the law are taken to this maximum security prison for an encounter with inmates who once started down that same road and are now doing time for things like robbery and murder. This program was developed by the inmates themselves, who said that little was done to help them when they were younger.
Get off that train, man. Get off that juvenile train. Don't think that all that little stuff that y'all doing now, you're going to get away with it forever.
1,000 youngsters from the Newark area have been through this, and so far, only a handful have had new problems with the law.
The juvenile justice system today does not do an adequate job. All these kids seem to know about the criminal justice system is that they're talked to. They're talked to by judges, by probation officers, by correctional counselors. What they really need, it seems to me, is certainty of being caught and certainty of being punished.
The treatment of juvenile offenders is an even greater dilemma than that of adults. Young people can be put away for a while, but they will inevitably learn more about crime on the inside. And when they return to their homes, whatever problems exist, family discord, drugs, alcohol, peer pressure, will still be there.
If you take a kid from the South Bronx on 135th Street and you send him to school, educate him a little bit, qualify him, give him some therapy, he becomes a perceptive, intelligent human, normal human being, then you send him back to 135th Street. He will be the only sane man on that block, and that will drive him crazy.
Almost nothing we have done to punish criminals has had much effect in reducing crime. Jails are warehouses with few resources to help people when they first get into trouble. Prison rehabilitation programs are judged to be generally ineffective. Parole, probation, and work release often fail for lack of supervision. We cannot decide whether we are too strict or too lenient with juvenile offenders.
You want to come get him tonight?
Yeah, I'll come and get him.
Most Americans do not want to live in a police state, but they are demanding freedom from the fear of crime, and they want criminals to be punished. One answer is simply to build more prisons and fill them up, to remove criminals from society no matter what the cost. Another is a complete overhaul of our criminal justice system, with a lot more attention to the conditions in society which cause crime. But that is an enormous commitment, and one which we have up to now been unwilling to make. Bill Plant, CBS News, New York.
Former Louisiana Congressman Richard.
So you can see with that clip that there was a lot of things going on that were wrong there, but it shows you kind of what the spirit of the times was, or the zeitgeist, and how people were feeling back in 1977. And you can see the role that Martinson played. He really didn't believe that these psychological treatments were effective, which then supported the movement to get tough on crime, and with a special focus on juveniles. Robert Martinson actually came to very much regret his decision, and he eventually went on to take his life, in part because of how this turned out. But a lot of people argued against his conclusions and the conclusions that nothing worked. And it wasn't that necessarily treatment programs didn't work, but really that the quality of the research that was done was not sufficient, and therefore we couldn't draw adequate conclusions. Excuse me. So why do you think that is? Why do you think, if you look back to studies that you see back from 1945 to 1969, have you ever looked at those old studies? What do they look like? That was back when they don't have SPSS, things like that. You know, they weren't able to do the same kind of analyses. They didn't know, so much about research methods in terms of how we would properly analyze and design things. And so really what we look back at those studies that Martinson and his group looked at, the research methodology was so inadequate. It really was impossible to figure out what works. There was one study that I read about that took place in Canada in the 1960s with offenders in a maximum security mental health prison where they had nude encounter groups. So they had to take off their clothing because it felt like it wanted to break down all the barriers. And they were given psychedelic medications so that they could hallucinate. And therefore that was supposed to help them. And I think many of these people had psychopathic characteristics to begin with. It was supposed to help them break down the barriers, and it actually, they found that this kind of treatment made people worse. Obviously, I could tell you that, but so this was also included in some of this research, and that's what people were using. And so some of these programs were so poorly implemented and delivered, they weren't based on psychological research or methods, and it really was just the quality was so poor that we couldn't make anything, we wouldn't expect them to make any kind of an impact. So these negative views of rehabilitation were then challenged by researchers, and they argued that many of these broad generalizations and conclusions overlooked many positive instances of success. So you'll see that we're going to talk a lot about meta-analyses in these classes, and so that's when you look at a lot of different studies, and you look at kind of the average across multiple studies. Now what happens is, if you have some things that work and a lot of things that don't work, what's going to come out is it doesn't work. But if what doesn't work is so poorly designed, it's going to bring down the well-designed studies, regardless of how well-designed they are. So really, we gave little attention back then to the fit between the type of offender and the type of treatment provided. And now we know a lot more about that. And so what we did, people after Martinson started looking and teasing apart kind of the work that he and his team did. And they found that there actually was substantial research that showed that correctional treatment did exist. But because of that kind of moment in time that you saw from the video, nothing works became an instant cliche. And that really influenced popular and professional thinking. So that's where we had kind of the Giuliani cracking down on crime in the 1980s. That's when we saw kind of our lock 'em up, throw away the key, the 3 strikes you're out. And so we saw a lot more punitive restrictions, like a lot of treatment programs and education programs were thrown out of prisons, a lot of vocational programs. People saw us being soft on criminals, that they were getting things that other people weren't getting, like they were getting college educations, whereas other people were struggling to pay for them. And so there was a strong movement to change both the philosophy and the control of imprisonment policies. And so it was really kind of the lock 'em up and throw away the key. So we now saw things such as mandatory sentencing and the removal of certain recreational programs from prison, the 3 strikes you're out laws, which we're still reeling from today. We're having people in prison, during that period who are still there because of relatively minor crimes. We're also seeing mandatory sentences, and that's when they had increased sentencing for juveniles being sentenced as adults. You get more sentences for people who commit crimes with weapons, things like that. And so you can see here on this graph that the prison and jail population skyrocketed here through the 1980s, and that's in large part because of these 3 strikes rules. So people were getting sentenced for 25 years plus, and they were staying in there for long periods of time, and that's why we're seeing a lot of this prison overcrowding, to the point where America now has the largest prison population in the world. So if you think about, some of the countries in the world, that we have more people incarcerated per capita than any other country in the world is kind of a scary proposition. So what do we know now about the effectiveness of correctional programs? Well, there's still debate about the effectiveness of rehabilitation. And what the good news is that recent literature reviews and meta-analyses, and I'll give you something to read about what meta-analysis is so that you can understand it better, but really demonstrate that rehabilitation programs can effectively change offenders. And so basically about 50 to 85% of the treatment outcome research today shows that rehabilitative strategies and treatment programs do work. And so you'll see here from this chart that people who are at high risk for reoffending in that medium to high risk really do benefit from rehabilitation. So the green bars represent recidivism with without treatment, and the blue bars represent recidivism with treatment. So those people who are at medium to high risk, if you give them treatment, you can see that in some cases their reoffending will be more than halved. Those at the extremely high levels, we're not seeing such changes, and those at the extremely low levels, we're not seeing those changes, because those at the extremely low levels probably will not reoffend without treatment anyway. Those at the extremely high levels have, either psychopathy or some mental health issues that would cause them to reoffend no matter what we treat them. So those two areas we're still working on in terms of, or especially the extremely high ones, what we can do. But we know that with those groups in the middle, which the large majority of offenders fall into, that treatment programs do work. So Andrews, in the article that you're going to read this week, concluded that this pattern of results strongly supports exploration of the idea that some service programs are working with at least some offenders under some circumstances. So what does that mean? And that's where we come into this new treatment program that you're going to hear about, and you're going to hear about it throughout this course, called the Risk Needs Responsivity Model. And so we know that some treatment approaches are better than others, and that we have certain methods that work, and they must follow some basic principles. And these basic principles are what are known as the R&R principles, the risk needs responsivity. There's also the professional discretion and program integrity, which comprise these 5 principles, but the primary ones are the R&R, the risk needs responsivity, and I'll explain to you what those are. So risk. What we know from our psychological literature is that offender programs must target offenders who are at sufficient risk for recidivism so that reduction is measurable. So if you remember back to our table here, those at the low end, those at the left, we don't see really any benefit to treatment, because the majority of those guys, even if they don't receive treatment, don't reoffend anyway. So we're not going to see any change if we treat them. And in some instances, treating them can actually make them worse. It's not clear why that is. But we do have a lot of offenders who are at low risk, and they don't necessarily need psychological intervention. They maybe made a mistake, the incarceration or just getting apprehended is sufficient for them, and they don't necessarily benefit from treatment interventions. So we also aren't seeing the results. So we found that treatment programs that provide intensive services for low-risk offenders won't show a significant reduction in future criminal behavior, because there is such low risk. That's called the floor effect, because we're not going to see a lot of difference because there's already so little chance that they're going to reoffend anyway. So what we need to do is really identify those guys that are at medium to high risk for reoffending, and making sure that we're giving them adequate services. So those guys that are at low risk, maybe they need little to no services. Those guys that are at medium risk need kind of moderate level services, and the guys that are at high risk might need more intensive supervision. So we also, in order to do this, we have to have reliable risk assessments so that we can better put them into these treatment groups, but also so that we can monitor and make those release decisions. So, we're going back to our table here. Look at those guys in the extremely high risk. These are not many guys, but there are some guys here, and women, I say guys, they're men and women, that are really at high risk for reoffending. And we need to have tools that can determine who those people are, so that we can either decide not to release those people, or we can give them incredibly high levels of supervision in the community when they are released, so that that can prevent them from recidivating. So when we're measuring risk, there are 2 types of risk. There is dynamic risk and static risk. So dynamic risk are factors that are changeable, things that we can change with treatment. Static risk are things like people's age, the number of times they've offended in the past. No matter how much I treat you, I am not going to make you younger, at least not yet. I guess we have not developed that science. But why do you think our treatment programs must target dynamic risk factors? Well, for the exact reasons that I just told you, and that's because we cannot change static factors. So as much as I want to change your age or how many times that you have already been in prison, I cannot do that. And those are things that, or your gender, for example, we know that men are at higher risk for reoffending than women generally. So, that's not going to change with treatment. But we do have factors that are dynamic and things that we can change. Now, what we're going to do when we talk about dynamic risk factors is we're going to break them down, but things that we can change, just so that things are like attitudes, like how do people feel about criminal behavior, their cognitions. Do they think it's okay? Cognitions are their thought processes. Do they think it's okay to engage in sexual behavior with those who are underage? Their behavior regarding unemployment. We know that unemployment is a risk factor for criminal behavior. Education, similarly, lack of education is an increased risk factor for criminal behavior. Peers, do they have peers that are involved in the criminal justice system that are doing illicit or illegal things? Substance abuse, are they abusing drugs and alcohol? And do they have unstable relationship? Those are all things that are related to criminal behavior, but those are all things that we can change. So they're considered to be dynamic risk factors. Things that cannot be changed, which are static risk factors, are things like age, gender, and past criminal history. So why do we need to know about these static factors if we can't change them? Well, one of the important things is they are important for risk assessment. While we cannot change them, they place people at higher risk. We know that younger people who are male and who have larger criminal histories that start at younger ages are at higher risk for reoffending. And so those are the people that we need to give more treatment to and that we need to monitor more closely at the end of their sentences when they return to the communities. So now we're talking about the needs principle, the N in the R&R model. That refers to criminogenic and non-criminogenic needs. So we've talked about our dynamic risk factors, and those can then be broken off into two branches, criminogenic and non-criminogenic. So criminogenic needs are those dynamic factors that are associated with criminal behavior, like substance abuse and unemployment. So there's a direct link, if we look at our research, between people using drugs and alcohol and their willingness to engage in criminal behavior, or that it contributes. That's not to mean that everybody who abuses substances will be interned to the criminal justice system. However, there is a very strong correlation between those two factors. Non-criminogenic needs are things that are more indirectly related to offending. They may be, they may be not. For example, somebody who has, a fear of snakes, that's an anxiety disorder, right? A phobia. It could be related to their offending behavior. There might be some reason that their fear of snakes resulted in their offending, but probably not. Does that fear of snakes need to be treated? For example, if they live in the Florida, wetlands? Yes. But is that related to whether or not they are dealing drugs? Probably not. And so that's not something that we would focus on. So that's non-criminogenic. So we can treat those non-criminogenic things all we want, but they're not going to reduce recidivism. So treating those snake phobias are kind of irrelevant to the things that we want to target in these correctional programs. I mean, it may improve that individual's quality of life, but it's not related to reducing recidivism. And while we do want to improve quality of life, we have to focus on the recidivism risk, which is what we're doing in the criminal justice system. So we need to focus on dynamic factors, as we talked about, but ones that are directly related to the criminal behaviors, those criminogenic factors. So a recent meta-analysis, which again is kind of a bigger study that looks at many, many different studies and combines all those data together, they found that people who have antisocial cognitions, which means that they have cognitions that go against society or pro-offending, are more likely to reoffend. People who have values that support, criminal behavior are also more likely to offend. People who have behaviors that are, criminogenic, such as substance abuse, are more likely to reoffend. And there are also static factors like a history of offending, decreased age, so being younger, and being male. So when you think about designing an effective correctional treatment program, what does that mean then? Basically, it means that those are the things that you want to target, right? The things that research is showing that is related to recidivism. So those are the things that we want to address. And in this course, we're going to talk about how we're going to address those things and make those changes. The final R in the R&R model is the responsivity. And so that responsivity refers to the way that offenders respond to treatment. And responsivity has two aspects. The program design, so we have to design the program that are sensitive to the needs of the participant, but also the program delivery. So how can we overcome barriers to engagement in treatment? So one of the things that we need to think about when we're delivering these programs is that we're delivering it in a style and mode that addresses the learning style and ability of the individual. So for example, if we have a group of individuals that is illiterate, that they cannot read, and we give them pages and pages of handouts and readings, is that program going to be effective? No. If we have people for whom English is not the first language, and we are now delivering, programs to them in English. Are they going to get the most out of that? No. If we have people, who have not achieved a high level of schooling and who hate school, and now we're putting them in a classroom environment where I'm going to spend 3 hours lecturing them each day, are they going to benefit from that? No. So we need to make our programs responsive to learning styles or the abilities of our clientele. And so, that's how we have to adjust our programs accordingly. There are also certain characteristics of the client and therapist that influence responsivity. Our race, our gender, me being a woman and working with a group of men, that's going to affect the way they interact with me. We do have data that suggests that they interact differently with men than with women. Does that mean I cannot treat men? No, absolutely not. But I have to be aware that my gender is going to influence the way they respond to me. It's also the methods that we use, and we're going to talk a lot about this in this course, but the research has shown that cognitive, behavioral, and social learning approaches are the most effective treatment programs. So programs that we're following a psychodynamic model or models that are based not on CBT, which is short for cognitive behavioral or social learning, were not nearly as effective as those that were based on cognitive behavioral therapy. And we'll learn about in future lectures what that means. Professional discretion is one of the things that we do have to consider, and that's kind of the fourth principle in our R&R model. And that means that there are some unique factors that are not covered by the other three principles. So we've addressed risk, needs, and responsivity. And we have the people that are at moderate to high risk. They're getting adequate criminogenic treatments for those dynamic risk factors. They're targeting their responsivity issues. But I, as a clinician, know something that isn't covered in any of that stuff. So we may see that somebody's at low risk on all our risk assessment scales, but there's something that they've told me. They've told me that they've started hallucinating, and all they do is think about offending against, their neighborhood, the boy who lives next door to them. So even though they've never committed a crime before this crime, they've been doing everything they're supposed to do. They've engaged in treatment. This person is now telling me that they are thinking 24/7 about offending against their next door neighbor. What do I do as a clinician? I need to use that information in determining what kind of treatment that person needs and whether that person should be released. Do you want somebody next to you, living next door to you, who is thinking about or having delusions or hallucinations about offending against your child? No, because that person may act on them. They may have a psychotic break. There may be something going on with that individual. So this is where I, as a clinician, can use professional discretion. Now, here's the caveat. We know that professional discretion is often unreliable, so we need to base most of our decisions on, research that has looked at risk. So if somebody, but there are rare instances like the one that I gave you where you have this additional information that needs to be brought to the team and these decisions need to be made. The last principle, the fifth principle, is program integrity. And so the effectiveness of our interventions depend a lot upon our program integrity. So these treatments need to be delivered as they are planned and designed. So a lot of research goes into these programs. We think about, all the different elements and how they're going to be designed and delivered. And so if a program is poorly implemented by untrained people, where people don't get the adequate number of hours in the program, that program is not going to work. I have walked into programs where you have the guys who are sleeping at their desks with their coats over their head, and some, intern is standing there at the front lecturing. Do you think those guys are going to get anything out of that program? Absolutely not. You have to have people who are engaged. You have to have people who know what they're doing. I've also seen people reading from a book. That is not going to engage people. You have to be a dynamic person. You have to know where these people are coming from. You have to, target and engage them. And that's how you're going to get them, making change. So this is some data that looks at how many of the R&R principles are adhered to in a treatment program and the decrease in recidivism. So you can see that residence means whether they are incarcerated or not, and community is a community treatment program. But basically, if you don't adhere to any of the R&R principles, you're going to actually increase recidivism. However, the more principles of R&R you're adhering to, so 1, 2, and 3, you're seeing significant decreases in recidivism, with a lot of it, happening more in the community because those are the people that are lower risk to begin with. So what do we know? So in the article that you're reading, Andrews et al. In 1990, they found that for appropriate treatment programs, those that adhere to the R&R model, there's an effect size of 0.63. So effect size is similar to correlation that you learned about in your stats classes, where 1 is a perfect correlation. So an effect size of 0.63 is a very large effect size. And that means that programs that adhere to these principles of R&R, they really did show that they reduced recidivism. If you combined all treatment programs, good and bad, they still found overall that there's a 0.21, which is a small to medium effect size. So contrary to what Martinson said in the 1970s, our more recent treatment programs are still better than nothing, but the ones that are effective, Andrews and his colleagues concluded that rehabilitation is effective in reducing criminal behavior in at least some offenders. So what do we know? So after all of this, what have we concluded? So we know that from meta-analyses that in order for a treatment program to be effective, it has to be well designed, has to target those dynamic characteristics. It has to target criminogenic characteristics. Those are related to criminal behavior. It has to be properly implemented, targeting moderate to high risk offenders, and we have to use cognitive behavioral techniques. And if those things are adhered to, we're seeing large effect sizes in terms of reductions of recidivism. And so that's the basis of what a lot of what we're talking about in this class is going to be focused on.